Welcome to Dauphin Island Diaries. This is a podcast dedicated to the history of Dauphin Island, Mobile Bay, and the Gulf Coast that surrounds it. Twice each month, we bring you a story about the people, the places, and the moments that have shaped this island and the waters and coastline beyond it. Some of these stories are well known. Others have been buried by time and storms and shifting shorelines, but they're still here. So wherever you are, whether you're on the island, remembering it, or discovering it for the first time, find a comfortable place, take a deep breath, relax, and settle in, because this is one of those stories. Back in early November 2025, I was sitting in a folding camp chair at my campsite in front of my tent at the Dauphin Island campground, sipping the hot tea I'd just made, and I was contemplating the fact that when the Confederates had garrisoned Fort Gaines, the tents of the enlisted men were likely only a couple hundred yards to the east of where my tent was then standing. I thought about the fact that of all the structures on the island, I don't think any other is as old as the fort. Parts of it are now over 200 years old, and it's certainly been among the most imposing of all the structures on the island since it was begun in the early 1820s. And considering all this also made me to reflect upon what had been probably the most momentous event of many momentous events on the island, the role of Fort Gaines in the Battle of Mobile Bay. Like so many other such fortifications, the design of Fort Gaines had a fatal flaw. It presumed that anyone attacking the fort would obligingly do so from the bay side, and its fortifications and armament were constructed so as to be more powerful on that side. To a Marine veteran, the flaw in such thinking is immediately evident. There are literally miles of beach to the west where amphibious landings can easily take place and attack the fort from the rear. Unfortunately for the Confederates under Colonel Anderson, the Union Army under General Granger did just that. He landed a force on the island with siege guns and bombarded the fort from the west, while the U.S. naval forces under Admiral Farragut did the same from the bay to the east and northeast. The big naval guns, which were among the largest such at that time, were powerful to say the least. But it was Granger's siege guns attacking from the direction where the fort's defenses were weakest that really did the most damage. The fort that was expected to hold out for 6 months surrendered after only 5 days. How and why there came to be such a fort here and how it came to be built is a rather interesting story. It brings to mind other defensive fortifications that ultimately proved to be equally futile, like the French Maginot Line and the British guns guarding Singapore in World War II. And in spite of its futility and its ultimate obsolescence by the time it saw its first shots fired in anger, the story of Fort Gaines is a tale of intrigue and delays and even endurance and continued existence in the face of long odds. This endurance is remarkable because long before a single brick was laid at Fort Gaines, Dauphin Island had already demonstrated that permanence was not one of its defining characteristics. In 1717, a major storm altered the physical shape of the island. What is now Petit Bois Island, the locals pronounce this Petty Boy Island, off the coast of Mississippi, was once the western end of Dauphin Island. It was separated when wind and water reshaped the coastline. The island's present form is not original or fixed. It is the result of change, sometimes sudden, sometimes gradual, but more often than not, beyond human control. That fact doesn't warrant lengthy discussion now. It just simply establishes an important baseline. Instability was here first. Before flags, before borders, before fortifications, the island itself had already refused to stay put. And Just as the topography of the island itself was uncertain, political uncertainty lagged not far behind that physical instability. During the War of 1812, United States forces occupied Mobile and Dauphin Island in 1813. There is, no doubt, a certain irony in the fact that Dauphin Island was seized from Spain by forces under General James Wilkinson, a senior American officer who would later be exposed as the infamous Agent 13, a paid spy for the Spanish government. However, Spain still legally owned the territory at that time. Military possession and legal sovereignty were not the same thing along the Gulf Coast in the early 19th century, and that legal ownership issue would have to be worked out before the United States could move forward with fortifying Mobile Bay. And that legal ambiguity persisted for several more years. It wasn't resolved until the Adams-Onis Treaty, which was signed in 1819 and ratified in 1821. This formally transferred Spanish claims to the lands to the United States. As a result, during the period between 1813 and 1821, the United States governed and defended land it did not yet legally own. So, authority arrived in practice before it arrived in law. But while diplomats worked toward settlement, military planners moved ahead. In the aftermath of the War of 1812, the United States established the Board of Engineers for Fortifications, initiating what became known as the Third System of Coastal Defenses. Planning for new fortifications began as early as 1817, while the United States as yet was still occupying territory it didn't yet legally own. Fort Morgan and Fort Gaines were originally conceived together by at least as early as 1819 and were designed as paired defenses guarding the entrance to Mobile Bay. This planning actually predated Alabama's statehood, and it anticipated the formal transfer of sovereignty that would follow shortly thereafter. The mindset behind this process can be summarized plainly as, we're here, we're staying, the paperwork will have to catch up. And in this case, it eventually did. The Adams-Onis Treaty was ratified in 1821, and construction of Fort Gaines began that same year. But Fort Gaines was not just simply slow to rise, it also changed as it was built. It was originally conceived as a true counterpart to Fort Morgan, more or less as its twin. Fort Gaines was intended, with Fort Morgan, to form a symmetrical defense across the bay entrance. But decades of delay intervened. Funding interruptions, shifting priorities, and evolving military theory meant that by the time construction resumed in earnest in the 1840s, the original plans no longer reflected current military architectural thinking. A later supervising architect abandoned portions of the original design and updated the fort to reflect newer artillery and defensive theory. These changes weren't mistakes. They were genuine upgrades based upon the best pre-war understanding available at the time. But the problem was more fundamental. Pre-war design is static. War isn't. Once conflict begins, tactics and technology evolve at a pace fixed fortifications can't match. Masonry forts built to last are difficult, often impossible, to retrofit during active conflict. By the time Fort Gaines was completed, just in time for the Civil War, it was already a hybrid structure. Part third system masonry fort, part updated pre-war experiment, and 100% vulnerable to the realities of modern siege warfare. Its fate was shaped not by incompetence, but by time. You might be surprised to learn that Fort Gaines was never fully garrisoned by the United States in peacetime. That distinction belongs only to the Confederacy. In January 1861, Alabama militia seized Fort Gaines following the state's secession from the Union. The small detachment of U.S. Army engineers surrendered the post without resistance, and Confederate forces took control. And for the next 3 years, the fort was fully garrisoned and manned as intended by its designers, but by a government it was never designed to serve. Letters from soldiers stationed at Fort Gaines describe harsh conditions: blowing sand, brackish water, illness, and monotony punctuated by long stretches of waiting. Because it could only be reached by boat in those days, it was, in effect, cut off from the mainland, except when supplies were brought to the island. Disease claimed lives even before the fort's decisive test arrived. Then the real test, the crucible of combat, came in August 1864. At sea, Admiral David Farragut forced his fleet into Mobile Bay under fire. In addition to the twin forts guarding the mouth of the bay and Fort Powell guarding the Mississippi Sound entrance on Tower Island, Confederate defenses also relied heavily on what were then called torpedoes. These were both stationary and drifting contact explosives, what we would today call mines, not the self-propelled weapons that the term suggests today. Some were anchored in channels, others were released to drift with tide and current. Fortunately for the Union forces, not so much for the Confederates, many of these torpedoes failed to detonate. However, the USS Tecumseh struck one of the few that worked, and she sank rapidly, taking most of her crew with her. It is at this point that Farragut is said to have shouted the famous words, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." The U.S. fleet pressed on without knowing how many torpedoes would function or where they might be. His decision was courageous, but also contingent. Had more torpedoes detonated as designed, the outcome of the battle and Farragut's legacy might look very different today. Now he's viewed as a courageous leader pressing on in the face of danger, but had even a fraction of the dud torpedoes worked as intended, Farragut might today be seen as a reckless fool instead. Nevertheless, during the battle, Fort Gaines played little role in stopping the Union fleet, and on land the fort faced a different threat altogether. Union General Gordon Granger landed troops on Dauphin Island west of the fort and brought siege guns to bear against its weakest defenses and armament. Fort Gaines had been designed to withstand a 6-month siege from the bay. It was never intended to have to resist a concentrated landward bombardment in addition to a seaward shelling as well. After only 5 days, the fort surrendered. Design assumptions had completely collapsed under the reality of modern warfare. But let's be clear. The story of Fort Gaines does not end in August of 1864 with its fall into Union hands. Like many fixed defenses that outlived their original purpose, the fort continued to experience brief moments of renewed relevance. To be sure, none of them were long-lasting, and none of them restored the fort to its original level of strategic importance, but they did continue to breathe new life into its existence. The first of these happened in the late 19th century when changing global conditions once again drew attention to America's coastlines. The Spanish-American War and the rise of modern naval powers prompted the United States to reconsider its coastal defenses. As part of the Endicott-era modernization program, Fort Gaines received some limited upgrades, including the installation of disappearing guns designed to protect artillery crews while allowing heavy guns to rise, fire, and retract. These modifications were real improvements. They reflected contemporary thinking about coastal defense and the lessons learned from newer naval technology. But Fort Gaines was not re-garrisoned in the traditional sense. Only small detachments were stationed here, sufficient to operate the new guns, but not to restore the fort to full military significance. Fort Gaines was adapted rather than fully revived, and technology continued to advance. Static coastal fortifications, no matter how modernized, struggled to keep pace with increasingly mobile and powerful naval forces. By the time that the First World War arrived nearly 2 decades later, Fort Gaines had already slipped back into the margins of strategic relevance. The fort would see one final period of military use during World War II, though its role by then bore little resemblance to its original purpose. Rather than serving as a gun platform or a fortified stronghold, the fort became a place of observation. Small groups of coast watchers used the elevated position and open sightlines of Dauphin Island to scan the Gulf for enemy submarines and surface threats. There were no heavy guns manned here, no garrison drilled within the parade ground. The fort's value lay not in its walls or armament, but in its geography. Fort Gaines was no longer a fort in any meaningful 19th century sense. It had become a lookout. Between and after the World Wars, the federal government abandoned Fort Gaines entirely. Between the World Wars, without any military purpose, the structure was gradually absorbed into the daily life of the island's residents. Livestock grazed within its walls. Children played along its bastions and in its tunnels. Nature reclaimed what strategy no longer required. There was no dramatic collapse, only a quiet fading. And yet, still the fort endured. The federal government passed ownership of the fort to the state of Alabama in the 1950s. The state, in turn, eventually passed it along to the town of Dauphin Island itself to manage and maintain. Preservation eventually replaced purpose. Fort Gaines survived not because it was still useful, but because people chose and continue to choose to remember it. The walls and ramparts that once guarded Mobile Bay have become a place of reflection, education, and historical curiosity. The courtyard that once served as an assembly point for soldiers in formation and where livestock later grazed, today serves as a small amphitheater for local concerts and for fun events like the annual Massacre Island Pirate Days, Viking events, and even World War II reenactments. Similar to reusing materials taken from old buildings to make new ones, today the fort is home not only to historic preservation and interpretation, but also to the kinds of events that were never conceived when bricks were being laid so carefully to create this historic structure. But the very historic preservation that ensures that the fort is preserved and maintained for future generations is sustained entirely by the town and the tourism dollars that it earns through tours, gift shop sales, and the revenue generated by these special events. Modern capitalism is fueling the fire of historic preservation. Being there now, whether sitting in a nearby campsite chair with a cup of hot tea or walking the ramparts under a Gulf Coast sun, it becomes clear that Fort Gaines isn't a failed fort. More correctly, it's a record of assumptions. Assumptions about permanence on a shifting island. Assumptions about sovereignty before certainty. Assumptions about design keeping pace with war. Some of those assumptions proved wrong. Others merely aged out of usefulness. And yet the fort remains, not as a warning, not as a monument to failure, but as evidence that even structures built on imperfect assumptions can continue to endure long after their moment has passed. So that does it for this very first episode of Dauphin Island Diaries. I'm glad you joined us today, and I hope you found it worth your time. If you enjoyed today's story, you may be interested to know that Dauphin Island Diaries has a sister podcast, The Tennessee History Nerd, and that this week's episode for that podcast deals with a key figure in our story today, Admiral David Farragut. If you'd like to know more about Admiral Farragut, I encourage you to check out that episode. Look for the Tennessee History Nerd wherever you download your podcasts. In 2 weeks, Dauphin Island Diaries will be back to look at something even older than Fort Gaines. We're going to explore the Indian shell mounds. I hope you'll be watching for that episode to drop when we again explore where memories intermingle with the sand, the waves, and the wind. Until then, I'm Big John Summers, and these are Dauphin Island Diaries. May you enjoy fair winds today and a beautiful Dauphin Island sunset. Before we close things up, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the sources behind this episode. This story draws from a combination of historical writing, reference material, and on-site interpretation. I made use of entries from the Encyclopedia of Alabama, including material on Dauphin Island, as well as Forts Morgan and Gaines. I also leaned on published works such as Alabama and the Civil War History and Guide by Robert C. Jones, Mobile Under Siege by Paul L. Webb, and the USS Tecumseh in Mobile Bay by Daniel Smithwick. Additional historical context comes from materials provided by the American Battlefield Trust, as well as archival cartographic work by Henry E. Chambers. Much of the detail in this episode was also informed by on-site research conducted at Fort Gaines and the Dauphin Island Welcome Center, including museum exhibits covering the construction of the fort, the Battle of Mobile Bay, and first-hand accounts preserved in the Voices from the Past exhibit. As always, these sources help bring the story into clearer focus, but more than that, they help connect the place you can visit today with the events that unfolded there. I encourage you to look at them if you're interested in making a deeper dive.